I helped my brother with his medical expenses, but now my entitled sister expects me to buy her a penthouse, and my mother is furious that I refused. I'm a 36-year-old woman, the oldest of 3 siblings, my brother Leo, 34, and the youngest Clara, 28. Growing up, Leo and I had a relatively normal upbringing, but for some reason Clara was treated like royalty. I suspect it had to do with her being an unexpected addition to the family and, of course, being the baby of the house. She was always showered with special treatment, which I believe is why she grew into a spoiled brat. Our dad, at least, had some sense and would try to discipline her, but my mother, absolutely not. She wouldn't dare say a word against her. Precious Clara, and wouldn't let anyone else criticize her either. Clara's behavior was obnoxious, to say the least, yet my mother allowed it. Leo and I were significantly older, so until Clara turned 25, we mostly ignored her antics, brushing off her biting comments and superior attitude. But Clara wasn't just a brat. She could be downright cruel. During her teenage years, she made scathing remarks about our appearances, touting herself as the most attractive. Sadly, we couldn't even deny it. She inherited our mother's genes and was, objectively, quite pretty. On top of that, she would mock trivial things, like the majors we chose in college or the jobs we held. Once, at Thanksgiving, she had the audacity to tell Leo he would end up an unemployed burden on the family simply because he majored in literature. Another time, she berated me for my long work hours, claiming my eye bags would make me perpetually single because nobody wants someone unattractive who can't even make time for them. Clara's egoism and constant belittling made her intolerable. What made it worse was my mother's unwavering support. While my dad occasionally turned a blind eye, my mother would laugh along with Clara, dismissing her cruel remarks as jokes. And if Leo or I dared to defend ourselves, she'd call us overly sensitive, insisting we lighten up. With my mother wrapped around Clara's finger, the divide between us only grew deeper. When my father passed away 8 years ago, that divide became a wall. He had been the glue holding the family together. Albeit imperfectly, after his death, Leo and I naturally drifted away from our mother and Clara. While we'd occasionally meet at family gatherings, hosted by others, or exchange a few words during the holidays, our relationship was strained at best. Honestly, I preferred it that way. My mother had her favorite child, and I had no expectations from either of them, nor did I believe they had any from me. That's why I was stunned to discover their expectations were very different. A few weeks ago, I helped Leo cover his medical bills after he fractured his ankle. While his insurance covered hospital expenses, I paid for his medications, physiotherapy, and even hired a full-time nurse to assist him since he lives alone. Leo initially resisted, insisting he could manage. But he was in between jobs, focusing on launching an online magazine. I didn't want him to drain his savings, and as a CFO of a thriving company, I could easily afford to help him. It was a no-brainer for me. Unfortunately, when my mother and Clara learned about my assistance, they assumed it gave them a free pass to treat me like their personal ATM. That's how I ended up in this mess, because I said no when Clara demanded I buy her a penthouse apartment. Clara's reaction to my refusal was as dramatic as I'd expected. 3 days ago, she called me out of the blue while I was working. She excitedly told me about a penthouse apartment she'd found and wanted to buy. According to her, living with our mother at 28 had become embarrassing, and she was desperate to move out. She could only manage half the price and expected me to cover the rest. Her logic? Since I had helped Leo with his medical expenses, I now owed her the same kind of support. Her request left me utterly baffled. Over the past 8 years, our interactions had been sparse and mostly strained. On the rare occasions we met, it was out of obligation, and Clara rarely made an effort to be pleasant. Yet here she was, expecting me to help her buy a luxury apartment as though I owed her something. For context, Clara calls herself a freelance graphic designer, but that's putting it generously. She doesn't have any formal training, no degree, and has only ever created a few posters for our father's business, which weren't even used. Most of her so-called exclusive clients are family members, coerced by my mother into giving her small gigs to keep her busy. It's a hobby at best, not a real career. Unsurprisingly, she's remained financially dependent on my mother, who funds Clara's extravagant lifestyle, while neglecting her own financial stability. When I told Clara I wasn't going to help her, she launched into an argument. She claimed I was playing favorites by helping Leo with his medical bills but refusing to assist her. She said it was my duty, as the eldest sibling, to support her, especially since she didn't have the money and no one else was stepping up to help. I calmly explained that my situation with Leo was different. He has a strong relationship with me, he was in between jobs, and he's made significant efforts to stay connected. None of that applied to her, but I didn't share these thoughts with her directly. I simply said no and ended the call. Clara tried calling me several more times that day, but I muted her and focused on my work. Later that evening, my mother called, and as expected, she was furious. She began by whining about how unfair everyone was being to poor Clara, accusing me of playing favorites. According to her, Clara had searched for an apartment for a long time and had finally found one she liked. My mother revealed that Clara had even approached our uncle, my father's younger brother and current head of the family business, for help. Unsurprisingly, he refused. My father's shares in the company had passed to my mother after his death, giving her a comfortable lifestyle. However, Clara's extravagant spending habits had left her struggling to manage their finances. My mother admitted that she couldn't afford to help Clara buy the penthouse, which was why she was turning to me. She even claimed that helping Clara now would ease her own financial burden in the long run. I couldn't help but roll my eyes at her reasoning. I told her bluntly that this wasn't my problem. If Clara wanted to move out, she needed to find a stable job and save up. Otherwise, she could stay with our mother until she was 35 for all I cared. That's when my mother snapped. She accused me of being ungrateful, reminding me that I owed everything I had to the way my parents had raised me. According to her twisted logic, I was in debt to my family and had a responsibility to repay it by supporting my siblings. I didn't bother arguing further. I reiterated that my decision was final and was about to hang up when my mother dropped a dramatic ultimatum. If I refused to help Clara, she would cut me out of her life entirely. Her threat was bold, but honestly, it didn't faze me. Over the past 8 years, my mother and I had been so distant that we were practically already low contact. Going completely no contact wouldn't make much of a difference to me, no matter how dramatic she tried to make it sound. Still, her audacity annoyed me, so I calmly told her that when Dad passed away, Leo and I had already made peace with how things would change. We knew she had a favorite child and had accepted that reality long ago. I told her outright that she had no right to accuse me of playing favorites, when she had done the same thing for years, always siding with Clara. I also reminded her that she had long stopped treating Leo and me like her own children, focusing entirely on Clara instead. I explained that both Leo and I had built lives of our own and didn't owe her or Clara anything. Saying those words felt incredibly freeing, as if I'd finally released years of pent-up frustration. My mother, on the other hand, didn't take it well. She yelled at me, declaring that she was definitely cutting me off this time and would make sure we never spoke again. Instead of feeling hurt, I chuckled. "That's fine by me," I said, "and honestly it makes things easier. I won't have to invite you to my wedding now. Maybe I can use that space for someone who actually deserves it." Before she could respond, I hung up the phone and blocked both her and Clara on every platform. You see, my mother had always shared Clara's warped view of me, that I was destined to end up single and unhappy because I prioritized my career. But she couldn't have been more wrong. I've been in a loving relationship with my fiancé, Ethan, for nearly 5 years. At 37, he's a compassionate, thoughtful man who understands me completely. He's met my mother and Clara a handful of times, but he's aware of our strained relationship. A few weeks ago, Ethan and I got engaged, and we decided to celebrate with a small, private engagement party. I had considered inviting my mother and Clara out of politeness, but after this fiasco, I realized there was no need. Cutting them out entirely felt like the right decision. However, they didn't seem to take the hint. Just yesterday, Ethan received a message from my mother on social media. She told him how hurt she was that I had blocked her and Clara and accused me of ending what little family connection we had left. She claimed to be disappointed in me and wished me happiness, though the message dripped with passive aggressiveness. At first I felt bad. Their accusations made me question whether I'd gone too far. Was I really in the wrong for standing my ground? Their message stayed on my mind, and for a moment, I started to feel guilty, but then I spoke to Leo about it. He reminded me of everything we'd endured growing up and how our mother and Clara had manipulated us for years. He believed they were simply trying to guilt trip me into apologizing and reopening the door for more of their toxic behavior. Ethan, too, was sympathetic, but I could tell he was having a hard time understanding the situation. He's incredibly close to his family, so witnessing this fallout was difficult for him. Every time he'd met my mother and Clara, they'd been on their best behavior, so he didn't grasp the full extent of the dysfunction. To help him understand, I asked Leo to explain some of our past experiences, and Ethan's perspective shifted almost instantly. He told me that if his own family had treated him the way mine had treated me, he wouldn't have hesitated to cut ties either. That reassurance helped me feel more confident in my decision. After that, Leo, Ethan, and I all blocked my mother and Clara completely. It felt liberating to sever ties and no longer maintain the facade of being one big happy family. For as long as I could remember, our relationship with our mother had been fractured by her blatant favoritism toward Clara. Choosing peace over pretense was the best decision we'd ever made. For a while, it seemed like things were finally settling down. But then, about a week later, our uncle called. He had heard about the fallout and wanted to discuss something concerning the family business. Apparently, our mother had decided to transfer half of her shares to Clara. While he didn't object to her decision to gift Clara shares outright, what worried him was her insistence on giving Clara voting power within the company. Our uncle was deeply concerned. Clara had no business experience, no qualifications, and no understanding of how the company worked. Giving her voting rights would be a disaster. Our father had trusted his brother to run the business after his death, and our uncle had done an excellent job maintaining it. The thought of Clara meddling in its operations alarmed him. Since my uncle didn't want to confront our mother directly, he asked if Leo and I could talk some sense into her. We were reluctant at first, but after discussing it, we realized how much our uncle had supported us after our father's passing. We owed it to him to at least try. So we went to our mother's house to have a conversation. Unsurprisingly, Clara was there, and her presence immediately made everything more tense. Still, we ignored her and focused on addressing our mother. We explained that giving Clara voting rights would go against everything our father had wanted for the business. He'd always told us that if something happened to him, his brother was the only one he trusted to take over. Our father had made it clear that he didn't want any of us interfering, and we had all agreed to honor his wishes. For the first time in years, my mother actually listened, albeit reluctantly, but as she seemed to be considering our words, Clara jumped in and accused us of being jealous. She claimed we didn't want to see her succeed, and were only there to ruin her chances. I did my best to stay calm, though it was infuriating. I reiterated to my mother that this wasn't about jealousy or personal grudges. It was about respecting Dad's legacy. But Clara wasn't having it. She started screaming at us, telling us to leave and threatening to call the police if we didn't. Leo stepped in and firmly told Clara to back off. Meanwhile, I continued trying to reason with our mother. I reminded her how much effort Dad had put into building the business from the ground up. He had spent years dedicating his life to its success, and the only person he had ever trusted with its future was his brother. Dad had explicitly told us that he didn't want any of us, me, Leo, or Clara, involved in the company, because he wanted to avoid conflicts or unnecessary drama. I begged my mother to consider what Dad would have wanted. If she went through with giving Clara voting rights, it would go against everything he stood for. For a moment, it seemed like she was actually thinking it over. But Clara, realizing that she might be losing ground, escalated the situation. She turned to me and sneered. "You've already decided to cut us off, haven't you? You've made it clear that we're no longer family. So why are you even here? You don't belong in this house anymore. If you're so desperate to have control, go somewhere else because this place isn't yours." I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I tried to ignore her. My focus was on my mother. I reminded her again that Dad had specifically wanted to avoid any family drama with the business, and this situation was exactly the kind of mess he'd feared. "Can we please, just this once, set aside our differences for Dad's sake?" I asked. But before I could say more, my mother cut me off. She told all of us to be quiet and then turned to me and Leo with a cold expression. "You've disrespected me enough," she said. "You blocked me. You've treated me like I don't exist. And now you're here lecturing me about what I should do with my own shares? You've crossed the line. I'll think about what you've said, but for now, I want you both to leave and stay out of my life." There was no use arguing further. Leo and I had done all we could. Clara, of course, stayed behind, smug as ever. As we left, all I could do was hope that my mother would reconsider. When I got home, I told Ethan everything that had happened. He reassured me that I'd done my best and reminded me that, at the very least, I could tell my uncle I'd tried. Later, Leo and I spoke to our uncle about the situation. He wasn't optimistic but appreciated our efforts. We waited anxiously for an update, unsure of what decision our mother would ultimately make. Finally, after 2 agonizing weeks, our uncle called with news. My mother had agreed to respect Dad's wishes. Clara would not be given voting rights in the company. However, she still transferred some preferred shares to Clara, ensuring she would have a steady income without any decision-making power. I was relieved. The business was safe from Clara's incompetence, and our father's legacy remained intact. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was the best we could have hoped for. It's been a couple of months since then, and I've had no contact with my mother or Clara. Honestly, it's been one of the most peaceful times in my life. Cutting them off has removed so much unnecessary stress, and Leo and I are thriving without their toxic presence. I'm especially happy because I'm getting married in just 1 week. Ethan and I sent out invitations a month ago, and of course, neither my mother nor Clara received one. Initially, I assumed they wouldn't care about being excluded, but apparently I underestimated their flair for drama. A few relatives informed me that when my mother and Clara found out they weren't invited to the wedding, they threw a fit. They even started urging family members not to attend as some kind of bizarre protest. Thankfully, their efforts seem to have fallen flat. Most of our relatives ignored them completely. I couldn't help but laugh when I heard about their antics. Did they really think they had enough sway to turn the family against me? It was just another example of how delusional and self-centered they both are. In the meantime, Clara and my mother have made some big changes in their lives, or rather spun their usual situation into a new narrative. My mother decided to put our old family home up for rent and moved into the penthouse Clara had been raving about. Of course, Clara couldn't afford to live there on her own, so she stayed with my mother, claiming she was helping by taking care of her. They've painted their arrangement as some noble sacrifice, with Clara portraying herself as the devoted daughter and my mother acting like the helpless victim who's ever so grateful for her support. It's ridiculous, but honestly, let them have it. If nothing else, they've proven they're good at weaving their own little fantasy worlds. Meanwhile, Leo's online magazine has really taken off, and I couldn't be prouder of him. He's finally living his dream, and I know his success will only continue to grow. As for me, I'm thriving too. I have a successful career, and I'm about to marry the love of my life. It's funny to think back on all the times Clara mocked me, saying I'd never find happiness because of my ambition and career focus. Every cruel word she said has been proven wrong, and honestly, that feels like the best kind of poetic justice